Well, good morning, everyone. The Insurance Bureau of Canada is certainly pleased to present this morning's session. We have been working with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce for some time now on the sharing economy, and I would like to thank Alan Odette for his leadership on this emerging issue. For IBC and its members, the sharing economy presents both challenges and opportunities. While we are focused on consumer protection and meeting the insurance needs of Ontarians, we also want to adapt to the growing popularity of the sharing economy. And already we are developing innovative solutions to meet the changing needs of consumers. Our members offer telematics, or usage-based insurance. We are looking at the possibility of having electronic pink slips. And we have presented a proposal to the Ontario government regarding insurance coverage for transportation network companies. Indeed, consumers will continue to drive change in a variety of industries, and whether Ontario realizes the economic potential and benefits of these changes remains to be seen. And so this morning's session is both timely and important. So I would now like to introduce the moderator for this morning's session, KARL BALDAUF. KARL is the Vice President of Policy and Government Relations at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, having joined in May 2015. He previously worked in advocacy and communications in the public and private sectors, as well as in politics and with stakeholder organizations. Throughout his career, he has worked with the province's leading officials in politics and at the senior-most executive levels to craft policy that supports Ontario's business community. So please join me in welcoming KARL to the stage.
Thank you, Doug. And I'd very briefly like to acknowledge IBC one more time. You know, everything that we do at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce depends upon our corporate members helping us out, coming to the table. And I think every time we've asked IBC to partner on an initiative, whether it be our OBAC events, the Ontario Economic Summit, or a lot of the policy work that we're doing right now in the sharing economy, they've come to the table. So one more time, I'd like to thank IBC. I am very lucky to be sharing this sharing economy stage with the following participants. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming to our stage our speakers today, Ian Black, April RINNE, and Tim WOOTTON. So very briefly, before I introduce our speakers, the Ontario Chamber of Commerce in recent months has embarked upon some significant advocacy as it relates to the sharing economy. In front of all of you on your tables, you'll find a report that we recently put out this past August, harnessing the power of the sharing economy. And I think in a lot of ways, the OCC recognizes the potential opportunity. So we're very happy to be delving a little deeper into this issue today with the panelists that we have here. And they're really thought leaders, not just here in Ontario, but internationally. As General Manager of Uber Canada, Ian is responsible for Uber's Canada operations. His mission is to reinvent transportation in Canadian cities by seamlessly connecting people and goods with reliable, affordable, and safe transportation. Uber Canada has offices in Toronto, Mississauga, Ottawa, Montreal, Edmonton, and Calgary, and operates in over 30 municipalities across the country. Ian joined the company in early 2014, and prior to Uber, he worked for Bain & Company, Google, and Helios Solar Energy. Our next panelist is April RINNE, to my direct left. She is the Sharing Economy Advisor for the World Economic Forum. April is a sharing economy and sharing cities expert, focusing on the linkages and opportunities between the sharing economy and cities, policy, travel, and emerging markets. April currently advises companies, governments, entrepreneurs, think tanks, investors, and development banks working across for-profit and non-profit models. She is a young global leader at the World Economic Forum, where she leads the Sharing Economy Working Group and serves on the Urbanization Advisory Group. And to my far left, we have Tim WOOTTON, who's the founder of Rover Parking, the newest sharing economy app in Canada. Tim has always had a knack for the unknown. He majored in entrepreneurship at Dalhousie University and has continued down the path ever since. Previously, Tim held several management positions at SMEs, most notably Kingsmill Food, where he was integral in the expansion and eventual sale of the business. He is currently a lecturer at McMaster University, where he has the privilege of inspiring other entrepreneurs. So, let's get going with our discussion today. Many of us in this room, and myself included, are users of the sharing economy, but there are a lot of existing operators, and many of them proud and active members of their local chambers of commerce across Ontario, that are concerned about how fast the changes are coming. I'm actually heading up to Parry Sound next week to discuss the sharing economy, and I've been warned that many local hotel operators are concerned about what the sharing economy could mean for their businesses. Ian, I know you face similar arguments in the transportation industry. Are these concerns valid? How do you respond to them? And how should government respond to them?
It's a fabulous question, and it's facing a lot of industries, and I'll speak specifically to the transportation industry. I think as government looks at these issues and looks at all the disruption, it's important to make the decision, which has been highlighted in a number of the panels this morning, which is, do we want to be a province and an economy that sees the future and moves towards it quickly, or do we want to be someone that's lagging behind? And that's an important decision, because if we choose to be an economy in a province that fast forwards to the future, that requires that we take quick action and that we take quick successive action. So I think there's an opportunity for government to probably move faster in this respect and look to jurisdictions around the world, many of whom have been moving faster than Ontario. Not to say that Ontario's been lagging, but there have been jurisdictions who've jumped into this more fully than Ontario has. And we can start to look at those and see other ways where we can create a framework where more companies feel that Ontario is a good place to enter. So we can go through all sorts of specific examples, but I think there's a great example that came to Ontario yesterday, which was a private member's bill put forward by Tim Hudak, which effectively took a regulatory framework from across the US that we've seen in place and customized it for here in Ontario. So I think there's an opportunity to move a bit faster in that respect, and really the concerns that are raised by existing industries, they're completely valid, and we need to take them into account. But just because they're there doesn't mean that we as a province shouldn't be acting and shouldn't be actively looking to what the future looks like and trying to accelerate towards that.
April?
Yeah, I would very much echo what Ian is saying. And at the same time, the way that I've been framing it recently is governments need to lean in broadly to the sharing economy. This isn't about fighting. This certainly isn't about ignoring. And broadly speaking, it's not about banning these platforms either. It's about leaning in, and what does that look like? And we'll speak a little bit more in a bit about different jurisdictions and who's doing what. But as I've done more work across countries and across cultures, I find it very interesting that you need to take a sort of baseline snapshot of the kind of economy that we're working in. We've been talking about this morning. The economy of Ontario is different in its political, social, economic history than the economy of San Francisco, which is different than the economy of Berlin, which is different than the economy of New York City. And as a result, the sharing economy as a whole and the arguments of existing operators look and feel also a bit different. And I also will remind you that, and it's been said before, this regulating and figuring out how we're going to regulate and what incumbents' interests are in the face of unknowns and incomplete information, that's nothing new. This is the latest iteration of something we've been dealing with forever. So as we look at what are the concerns of existing operators, I always stop to say, what are you concerned about? And if you're concerned about something that has to do with your status as an incumbent, or your ability to get rent, that's not necessarily a risk that is ingrained in the public. Versus, are you concerned about something that might affect society as a whole, the public interest and so forth? And we need to sort of distinguish between what I would call real risks and perceived risks. And for incumbents, I often will say too that it's kind of like investing in technology. We could say 20, 30 years ago, you invested in CDs, and CDs then got leapfrogged by other forms of technology. You made a bad investment in the technology. We don't think anything about that kind of outdated technology. Yet when we look at some of these business models that are now underway, we look at it and we say, so you invested in a business model that served you well for many, many years, decades even. But now that technology may be a bit outdated itself. So how do we keep up with that? So I really look at that interplay between the real and perceived risks, but also what do these new technologies mean specifically to the economy of Ontario, as it may be different than other places.
Thank you. Tim, what's your perspective on this?
I mean, as a startup myself, I mean, there's been a theme here so far about startup, and Rover parking is one of those. I started Rover about a year ago, and we've only been live in Toronto for a couple months now. So Rover parking is the Uber or the Airbnb of parking, if you will. And what we really need as an Ontario-based startup is for the collaboration of government to help us grow and help us grow in Toronto and help us want to stay in Ontario to grow this company. Because, when I first launched Rover, the initial talk about it wasn't embracing the technology. It was being a little bit more afraid of this technology. And unfortunately, as a startup that, doesn't have the same budget that Uber might have, it's a little harder to get the message out about what we want to do. And, Uber's been incredible and very successful at doing it from the bottom up and really getting the users to see how great the experience is and using that to talk to government and to show that change. For someone like Rover right now, we need to come at it from the top down a little bit and have government saying, this is change, this is where we're going, and how can we look at companies like Rover, like Uber, like Airbnb, and how can they work together to help make cities better, to help make our economy better, because it's so much more than sharing a driveway for me. There's a lot more that can be done there, and we really need to collaborate in order to move that forward.
I'm going to jump in, if it's okay, with one more comment. It's also important as we think about those concerns and we recognize those concerns, it's important to look forward to what the future could be. So as we think about the sharing economy and other disruptive innovations going on in the economy, in the face of some really hard policy challenges, income stagnation, unemployment, the sharing economy opens up a huge potential to create jobs and to create economic activity that we didn't have 5 years ago. So we need to balance the challenges, but we also need to recognize that the sharing economy could, in the next 2 years, create somewhere around 50,000 jobs. Not full-time jobs, but 50,000 opportunities for Ontarians to earn more money with existing assets. That's a pretty good policy outcome as well. So it's important to keep eyes on the fact that the upside here is probably bigger than the potential downside of being conservative.
Thank you. So we know Ontario is part of a large pack of jurisdictions that are trying to figure the sharing economy out. And if you look in your report, the OCC report, you'll see a lot of interesting survey data on what Ontarians think when it comes to the sharing economy, how they feel. And we found through a poll that we conducted with Leger that 2/3 of us believe that the growth of the sharing economy is a good thing for our economy. So April, you have an international perspective on this. Where does Ontario fit vis-a-vis other jurisdictions?
Yeah, so great question, and one that I'm happy to talk about. I was chatting with some folks during a break, and I mentioned the fact that this year alone, for anybody who thinks that the sharing economy isn't global, this year I've been in 17 countries just working on sharing economy issues. Now, that is unprecedented. Now, I might be a little bit insane when it comes to the number of miles that I'm clocking, but I think it shows you just how pervasive this is becoming. And for those of you who don't know, I'm actually based in San Francisco. I've done quite a lot of work here in Canada over the last couple of years, and so I'm thrilled to be back. And I wouldn't be coming back so much if I didn't really like what I was seeing happening here. So at the broad brushes, I love the approach that you guys are taking in terms of it's quite thoughtful. Now, where you are on that spectrum, I would say that you're actually more level-headed than most, being more thoughtful and more pragmatic, a little bit less reactive than we see in a lot of other jurisdictions. I might also say, and this is where I sort of apologize, I didn't tell you this in advance, you guys are so focused on Uber, I can't even believe it. Sorry. Like it's sharing economy, Uber, no, there's this whole universe of sharing economy activity that's happening. Take advantage of it, because what I'm looking at is, so it becomes a much more polarized conversation, if you will, here, because it just immediately goes to Uber. And again, with all due respect, in my presentations, in my work, I rarely mention Uber. Why should I? Everybody knows what it is, but there's all of this other stuff that's happening that helps to place Uber in this larger context. And I think building upon what both Ian and Tim said, we need to be looking at the sharing economy as something a bit more integrated, as something in particular that can benefit the city. Cities, by and large, are not putting themselves at the center of this conversation and saying, how can the sharing economy help us deliver public services? How can it help us build community? How can it help us save money, et cetera, et cetera? And I would say there, Ontario, broadly speaking, is kind of in the middle of the pack, because a lot of places aren't yet at that point. But those that are really looked at as leaders in this space, that's what they're starting to do. Now, have they figured out the policy issues yet? By and large, no. But they actually have more skin in the game. They're starting to invest public funds. They're starting to take city-owned assets and put them into shared use. They're starting to promote both for-profit and non-profit, and looking at the role that this means for low income and elderly and youth and all of that sort of thing. And I don't yet see Ontario in that category, but I do think because you're coming at this with such thought and care and real, just kind of trying to get your head around it, but being open-minded about it, the transition for you to get to that point, I think, will be much easier than some other places.
Yeah, we want to get it right. We know the OCC is an important part of that conversation. I can't go straight to Uber after those comments. So, Tim, given your perspective as a startup, you may have met individuals who are trying to do similar work to you in other jurisdictions. What's their experience versus yours?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, there's so much happening in the sharing economy right now, as April sort of said. And, being a startup in Ontario right now, I've been able to travel around a little bit and talk to people in other jurisdictions. And some places certainly do grab a hold of it faster than others. And whenever you have the support of a city or a support of government behind you, you wind up being able to grow a lot faster. I mean, I talk to people in Toronto and Ontario every day who I tell about Rover, and the initial reaction is that is a great idea. I mean, you have a driveway that sits empty while you're away on vacation, or 9 to 5 when you're going to work, and it's this underutilized asset that you're not putting to work. The hard part is then, well, how do we get on board? What is the sharing economy? We're changing the conversation, and it's great, and we're getting on these panels and we're having the conversations in rooms such as this. It needs to become a more public conversation so that trust behind the sharing economy really exists. And you're seeing that in some cities, and in some cities you aren't as much, but we really need to embrace this and tell the public, hey, this is something that's coming, we're working together to make this better, and this is the type of technology you can trust, and how we can build cities moving forward to get into that sort of smart city model that's sort of a buzzword that everyone's talking about.
And then, Ian, I guess you have a view that comes from being part of an international company, but with a specific focus here. So what are your colleagues in other jurisdictions saying that have the same experience of you trying to advance Uber within those countries?
Yeah, it's good to put in that context, because I think when you put Ontario in the context of what's going on around the world, there's definitely a case to be optimistic, but there's also a case to be pessimistic, and we don't know where we're going to fall quite yet. The case for optimism, I think, is examples like Ontario moving on autonomous vehicles. Fabulous, sends a strong signal. Uber does some work around autonomous vehicles, and you better believe that announcement was noticed within a second, and global companies take note of that. I think other reason for optimism, some of the movement we've seen in the last few days around private members bill at the Ontario level, but also the mention in the budget last year of the sharing economy and the clear, diligent work, as you described, being done by the government to look at these issues. So that's all good, but as good Canadians, we think about these issues, we're deliberate, we haven't been quite fast enough to act, and speed matters here, because whether certain companies choose to set up in Canada or whether certain companies choose to come to Canada will be a decision they make very quickly. and they aren't going to wait around for a year for that framework to be set. So I think the case for pessimism is a company like Uber. We've been here in Ontario almost 4 years, and we're still effectively having the same regulatory debate we had when we first arrived. So I think there's an opportunity here for all of us as business leaders, but also as government leaders to think, okay, enough talk, let's get moving.
Some of the sessions that we had earlier today looked at the challenges facing organizations that wish to scale up. So Tim, how can we start to help sharing economy companies in Ontario scale up?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but collaboration and trust is massive for me right now. You know, there's sort of the saying, any press is good press. And I mean, the reason why Rover got a lot of press in Canada was to do with some of the controversy. But then that doesn't really translate into people actually using the product itself because they're still trying to understand it. It's trust between the consumer and the company, between the company and the government, and between the user and the government, and everybody being on that same page in order to push stuff like this forward. I mean, I had a conversation about a year ago with IRAP, and I mean, a lot of the talk has been about funding before this panel. And one of the things I heard back from IRAP was, look, we're not sure we want to invest in a technology like Rover because the chances are you're going to start growing in Canada and then you're going to move down to the States or be acquired by somebody down in the States. And, you know, you hear that from a funding body and it kind of takes a little bit of wind out of your sails because they're not willing to invest based on the chance that you may be going down to the States. We need to keep these in Canada. We need to get the companies like Rover in Canada, like Jobless, like Nixware. You're seeing a lot of these different successes. How do we keep everybody here? And it's, I mean, it really is about trust and collaboration and pulling everyone together.
April?
I'll pick up on that, both the trust piece as well as the scaling up piece. And I think my role here is a little bit to be provocative, to show the opportunity, but also be like, you guys, wait a minute. I want to challenge this whole notion of scale, and not that it doesn't exist, but how we've gone about it. So if you think about historically, and here we can talk about the ownership era and big corporations and all of that, the whole point of scale was to take one company and make it bigger. And usually that meant hiring more people, getting more inventory, building more offices, brick and mortar, like linear. Just keep, scale means big. That whole paradigm is starting to shift. I'm not saying it goes away, and there are any industry that has a high fixed cost, so energy being a great one, yeah, scale usually means bigger. You need big power plants and so forth. But as we look at the rise of peer-to-peer platforms and technology-driven companies, scale starts looking very, very different. And in particular, scale looks like a network. And a network is not about getting bigger and bigger and bigger necessarily. It's about being highly integrated, highly connected, and the value in the network is in those most connected nodes. So if you're a company, you start thinking, what does that mean for where I would build a factory or the kinds of people I would hire? Some might be employees, some might be independent contractors. What does this mean for how I'm building the business? I mean, we've already seen in the sharing economy all over the place where the largest companies own no inventory. So if we're talking about scale meaning inventory, that is obliterated already. So I want to sort of throw that open and say, yes, we need to promote scaling up. But scale itself looks and feels different. And there are all kinds of investment opportunities, management opportunities, growth opportunities in this. But I'm looking at this also from the perspective of the people that are part of this conversation who aren't, for the most part in the room today, are the members, for example, of these platforms. They are the Airbnb hosts. They are the Uber drivers. They are the people sharing their parking space. They're all of those folks who actually are part of the scale, but under today's metrics and today's corporate structures, they get lost in that conversation.
Sure.
So I'm just going to open that up as an opportunity, but more conversation.
Ian, do you have a perspective on this?
Yeah, we've got a saying within Uber, kind of an organizational mantra, which is let builders build, which means from an organizational point of view, you want to remove barriers to people who are builders doing the amazing work that they do. I think there's an opportunity for us to take that approach from a regulatory point of view. We should, as a province, be letting builders build. We should see examples. The example of Michael this morning was fabulous. He went to the regulator and said, here's a great idea, how can we make it work? and they said, yeah, that is a great idea. Let's make it work. But there's too many examples of entrepreneurs coming up with a great idea, and the default answer rather than yes is no. So if we can find a way to get the default answer to be yes, and to build a culture within government and regulatory bodies which gets to yes much faster, I think that's going to be how we really scale entrepreneurism and innovation in Ontario. And then the other thing I'd add is there's so many amazingly talented Canadians in the US, especially around the San Francisco area and internationally, who are building unbelievable companies. Why aren't we just yelling from the rooftops and giving them an amazing deal to come home and build in Canada? I think that's something that would help us scale pretty quickly as a province.
I have more questions, but we've been moving quickly this morning. I know we've been losing questions from the audience, so I wanted to take an opportunity. If there's anyone in the audience that has a question, maybe raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. No? Okay. Ian, my next question's for you, because you were talking about some of the legislation that's been happening here in Ontario, and I know you have an eye to that given your advocacy work. And with so much discussion of the right regulations, how is it that sharing economy companies can build trust with legislators and the public in order to prosper?
That's a great question. I think the work of the Ontario Chamber has helped us as a whole sector do that a lot. Because obviously trust can be built through conversation and through talking through issues and exploring each other's point of view. And the work that the Ontario Chamber has done on the sharing economy has been immensely powerful in that respect. So a huge amount of credit to the Chamber. So I think as an industry, and I can speak only for our company, we need to do a better job of sharing our perspective, taking the time to sit down and share information. There's a great example in Boston and in New York. Uber shares much of its data with local planning regulators, so they can see the map of all the trips that happen in a city, where the traffic flow is, where priority areas for infrastructure investment. Anytime a company sharing that information is coming to the table and showing how we can actually help the public interest, I think there's probably an opportunity for us as an industry and as a company to do more of that.
Sharing's the theme of the day.
Yeah.
Tim, building trust, how do we get there?
Yeah, again, it's really working together. I mean, Ian touched on it a bit there. It's figuring out, the insurance side of things as well, which is moving forward now, but again, it's something that's a little bit further behind. It's telling the whole story. It's knowing both sides of the equation and really working together to push forward what the sharing economy is. I mean, it's still very new. I mean, when did Uber come to Toronto?
3.5 years ago.
3.5 years ago. I mean, Airbnb was probably slightly more than that. So it's been around for a while. And I mean, as Ian said, it's been the same conversation for a long time. And the conversations that are happening now and here today are great. I mean, even this week, I'm on 3 different panels for the sharing economy. So we're seeing at different levels of government that people are starting to talk about it. Again, it's that speed to market and speed to actually having change so that, a startup like myself can flourish in a province like Ontario, as opposed to starting to look at different jurisdictions to see if maybe we could grow there faster than on Ontario because of different regulatory regimes.
April?
Yeah, so it's not really provoke, but I'll expand the conversation a little bit and say I think I'm going to challenge the notion of trust. So not really. But how do we build trust? I'm actually going to say we need to zoom out a little bit more again, and there's a big difference between what it means to trust somebody and what it means to be trustworthy. And historically, we've had this notion of trust, especially in the corporate setting. Trust us, we know what's good for you. Trust us, we'll deliver the best service. Trust us, we'll source our products sustainably, whatever the case may be. That's how, easy to say we can engineer trust. In this space, the sharing economy writ large, peer-to-peer platforms where I can connect with people in different ways directly, it's all about, are you trustworthy? Can I look at you and rely on you based on your actions over time, where I can look at you and say, I know that you're going to behave as you need to behave. That goes for an individual, and so the platforms are having to deal with what it means to build a trustworthy community, where people are providing services or sharing goods in a trustworthy way over time. And if they can do that, then it becomes a much easier conversation with regulators, but then the companies themselves as platforms have to show that they, as corporate entities, are also trustworthy and that they will behave in a way that aligns with what regulators would like to see and with the better interests of the public good. Now, I would also say, I'm going to challenge this and say, the regulators, and here Canada's in pretty good shape, Ontario, Canada as a whole is in pretty good shape, regulators have to behave in a trustworthy way as well. You don't always see that historically, where you put in place one policy and it may or may not go to plan, and then you have the public getting upset. So it's a trust and trustworthiness are two-way streets, but I think what we really need to look at is here, especially when we're looking at how to build trustworthy behavior between participants and between the platforms and the regulators, that there's a whole new opportunity opening up thanks to these technologies for individuals to do that, but also to track the effects and track the trustworthiness through the technology. And from a policy perspective, that's really hard to get your head around in terms of what does that look like and so forth. But there's a very clear pathway where self-regulation or some of these peer networks and peer, I sort of term them like breadcrumb trails of people's behavior and activity, can be used to alleviate some concerns of policymakers and can provide a very clear path towards what a lighter touch approach to regulation would look like.
We have a question down the front.
I just wondered, Elise Allen, GE, I just wondered if you could comment on education and how you think education needs to be changing in order to make sure that we're building both, I think, to your point, good leaders in the sharing economy, good regulators in the sharing economy. So what do we need to be teaching in the college, university, school system at any level so that we are, in fact, preparing people better to lead, grow, and expand in the sharing economy?
Who wants to start?
I can take that one pretty easily. Great question, and so many different jumping off points to take. So a couple things. In terms of what we can do today, there is a massive opportunity to just start educating the public about the sharing economy. And here you're doing a little bit more than other places, but I was here in early 2014 with SIG, Social Innovation Generation, headquartered at the Mars Design District. We did a national sharing economy, collaborative economy roadshow. I was in Montreal and here in Toronto and Calgary and Vancouver, just hosting public events to mobilize people, see what kind of interest was there. It was still, I think I can say, it was amazing success. But, so that's sort of mixing the pot. There's much more deliberate need for education of policymakers at the government level, so that's things like workshops and so forth. Within universities, there's an opportunity to develop curriculum. That's happening, but very, very thin and usually only around business schools. But here's where it's interesting. If you look at leaders in this space, and here I would point, for example, you may or may not agree with me on this one, but Seoul, South Korea, which is just looking at the sharing economy as a tool for urban planning. They have this huge initiative, which is about seeding grassroots sharing, and the government is hosting workshops every month on the sharing economy for the public at large, town halls and this and that, and they're integrating this into primary school education as well. So lots of different ways we can slice that. It may or may not have direct implications for policy, but massive. Just you kind of go down the line and see how many. We pretty much need to educate everybody at this point, and so sort of dive in and start wherever it makes the most sense.
Ian or Tim, do you have a comment on the education piece?
I think it does come down to sort of what April said, in that, you know, the millennials are the ones who are, for Rover anyway, the ones who are using the service to park. I mean, you'd probably say that your demographic is probably skewed a little bit more in that direction as well. So they're actually the generation that understands the sharing economy a little bit more. I think, and it was touched on in the previous panel, what we need to do is more on the entrepreneurship and innovation and show students the new way of entrepreneurship, and, you know, the more successful companies that we have coming out of Canada, you know, whether it be your Shopify's or your Hootsuite's, or, you know, we had Joanna up here from Nixware, and showing the ability of Canadian companies to be able to grow and have that success story is what we need to be teaching at that level. Yeah.
Just on the theme of education, I'll jump in. I think we do. It's a bit less on educating around the sharing economy, but how do we get an education system that promotes entrepreneurship and promotes people who are going to create the next big companies? A lot of our education it'll come as no surprise to anybody here in the room, is very conservative in Canada. We don't have either at the kind of through junior high or high school systems, we don't have particularly innovative models popping up the same way you start to see in the US that are more group-based and project-based education. And similarly at the post-secondary or secondary and post-secondary level, it's still fairly stuck in a model that we had 20, 30, 40 years ago. And clearly the workplace in technology is very different than the workplace in traditional companies. Much more value on bringing new ideas, on being independent, and it's a different workplace. I think the education programs that we have at universities probably need to do a refresh in this country.
April, you had an additional
Just
thought.
very briefly, because actually I really appreciate Ian and Tim's focus also on entrepreneurship here in Ontario, which is an area that I don't have as much direct exposure to, but I'm going to clarify one of the things I was saying earlier, which is kind of fun. In a way, part of this is just a timing game. Millennials, younger people, anyone who has grown up being able to find what they need with their phone is sort of, it's adopting, this is something you just sort of take for granted. You give that 20 years and the vast majority of people living in Ontario will fall in that bucket, just case in point. So on one hand, this is just a timing, letting things take root sort of situation. But what I'm focusing on is how do we get policymakers, for example, technology outpacing the law forever, how do we help play that game of catch up? How do we actually get people for whom they do remember the era before smartphones, and they do need, and they want largely to catch up or at least feel comfortable with what's going on and have more options available. That kind of education to close the gap, if you will, as well as get us to a point where policy negotiations, policy discussions don't take 4+ years to bear fruit.
So we just have a few minutes left, and in that time, I'd like each of you to have some closing remarks with a focus on, we've spoken about education, we've spoken about policy, but what are some of the immediate next steps that should be taken here in Ontario to help Canadian sharing economy companies grow and compete internationally? Let's start with Tim, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, being still very much a startup, one of the hardest things for me is funding right now. And what I have run into with some of the different bodies that I've spoken with is, you know, they have invested in a lot of companies. They understand how it works. They understand that startup in general is really difficult and a high percentage of them fail. So when they see a company like Rover, which has that added barrier of dealing with regulation right now, and you know, we have a team of 5 people. I'm now a lobbyist because I need to show up and sort of talk at events like this to try and get the word out for Rover. It makes it difficult to have that investment because these investors are looking at that extra hurdle and saying, well, let's see where this conversation goes on the sharing economy first before we put our money into it. And that's really scary for me because if I don't get funding, you know, in the next 6 to 12 months that's on the magnitude of a couple $1 million, you're going to have a company in the States that's going to come around and come to Canada and do the same thing. So right now, again, it's that collaboration and having government embrace it so that I'm able to go out there and fund it and know that Ontario is an area where I can grow and prove this business model so I can take it, you know, across Canada and into the States as quickly as I can.
Ian?
The 2 big questions on my mind on this question are, first of all, how do we get the next Uber or the next Airbnb or next Facebook, whatever, to be in Toronto? So I look at our company, one of our co-founders is Canadian, but there was never a discussion that Uber would be founded in Toronto rather than San Francisco. It was just assumed that the 2 founders met in San Francisco, of course they're going to start the company there. How do we build an environment where they have the conversation and decide to set that company up in Toronto and then have all the benefits flow from there? And long list of things I think we need to do there. A lot of them have been talked about today, but one of the key ones is, as government and as policymakers, how do those groups take a more disruptive mindset? How do they learn to disrupt their own processes, get comfort with being out on a limb a little bit, and by doing so we'll create a policy environment where people want to take risks here? That's one. The other area I think is really about how we take advantage of some of the big technologies that are coming. So in our world, Uber Pool is a product that brings carpooling at scale. We truly believe in a 5 to 10 year timeline, we can take hundreds of thousands of cars off the road in Ontario. We aren't going to get there, though, if we don't have regulatory structures that open up that innovation. The same can be said for autonomous vehicles, and that's why it's so exciting to see. So how do we identify those few key technological changes that are going to open things up, and then make sure we're very quickly creating policies that allow that to happen?
Yeah, sure. 3 quick points that I think build on what Tim and Ian have said. One is, and this is going to sound very basic, but what should you do to help grow these companies? Start using their services. Start participating. Start getting involved. Start understanding the power and potential of what's going on. Similarly, well, I guess I should say slightly a related light is start networking with other cities. Lots of cities are looking at this space. Connect with them. Share with them, learn from them, reach out to cohorts, and this is everything from people looking at this from the sharing economy from the perspective of livelihood creation or sustainable consumption and sustainability or traffic and congestion or whatever. But this, to build it, you've got to actually understand much better, and there's so many other places that you can learn from. And I really want to build on this. I'm not convinced it has to be how do we get companies for you to be, you're going to go international if you have to move somewhere. Sadly, that's a different kind of international expansion. How rather do we get more investment and more thinking about how we build the Canadian sharing economy, which will link internationally? But there, you know, many of you know this, San Francisco and Silicon Valley, these are clusters of economic activity, innovation activity, the universities that are involved. It's multi-stakeholder. And I will admit, for me, I can ride my bicycle to the headquarters of most of the better-known sharing economy companies, which on one hand is nice, and on the other hand, it's a little boring. So we need to start thinking about this whole, here's how we're distinct and different, could be a really good calling cry for people who, increasingly too, San Francisco becoming unaffordable and so forth. There's a neat message to be had there, but I think more broadly what we want to look at is how do you build that cluster of innovation activity, which includes investment, includes research, includes universities, and includes really, I would say, enlightened or very bold, bold leadership in terms of embracing some of these new business models.
Thank you, and thank you all of you. I can promise each of you that the Ontario Chamber of Commerce is going to continue to be a thought leader and provide support for growing those companies that identify as sharing economy companies. And this conversation reminds me, it's rare that the Chamber is asking government for regulation, but it's not necessarily more regulation, it's the right regulation. So everyone, please join me in thanking our panels today.